All right, diving into the world of Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield. You know, when you hear a name like that, or think about movies like Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or Silence of the Lambs, we're not dealing with just your average guy.
You're not kidding. His story's got to be one of the most disturbing, in true crime, I mean, really.
Definitely. But today, we're not here to just relive all those gruesome details. We're going deeper, trying to understand what could lead someone down such a twisted path.
Yeah, beyond the sensationalism.
Exactly. We've got court documents, psych evaluations, biographies, the whole 9 yards, a lot to unpack.
And I think what's really fascinating about this case is it forces us to think about how someone seemingly normal could have these incredibly dark secrets. It
Right.
challenges our whole idea of good and evil, normal, abnormal.
Totally. So let's start at the beginning. Ed Gein was born in 1906 in rural Wisconsin, lived on a pretty isolated farm.
Not exactly the most happening place.
No, not really. What kind of impact does that kind of environment, that isolation, have on a kid growing up?
Huge. I mean, isolation can be a major factor. Limited social interaction, always feeling different from the outside world. It can create a space for some unusual thought patterns, sometimes even dangerous ones.
Yeah, makes sense.
You see it in other cases too, where people just become detached from what we consider normal and they develop their own sense of reality, which can be really distorted.
Right. And for Gein, it wasn't just physical isolation. His mom, Augusta, had a really strong, maybe even damaging influence on him, didn't
Oh,
she?
absolutely. Augusta Gein, she was very religious, but her beliefs were, well, they were really rigid and judgmental. She saw the world as this den of sin, especially when it came to women.
Wow.
So you combine that worldview with the family's isolation. It had a massive effect on how Ed developed psychologically. Imagine growing up constantly hearing that everything and everyone outside your family is evil
Yeah, I mean, that would warp anyone's perception of reality.
and make it really hard to form normal, healthy relationships.
It's almost like she built a prison around him, both mental and physical. And then you've got his father, George, struggling with alcoholism. He couldn't really counterbalance Augusta's personality, so Ed's trapped between these two extremes.
A recipe for trouble, really.
Yeah.
And then Augusta forbids Ed and his brother Henry from having friends or socializing.
Right.
It's no wonder Ed grew up so shy and awkward. These early experiences, they're so critical in shaping who we become, how we relate to others.
It makes you wonder, how different could things have been if Ed had had a more normal childhood? Like if he'd been exposed to more people, different ideas. Could that have changed his path?
It's impossible to say for sure,
Yeah.
but we know those early childhood experiences really set the stage for our social and emotional development. Being deprived of those positive interactions, especially during those key years, it leaves a mark.
Mm.
And with Ed, it's pretty clear that those early experiences played a role in how he struggled to connect with people and deal with, the complexities of relationships.
Right. It's like they say, hurt people hurt people. Obviously, that doesn't excuse what he did, but it's important to understand where that darkness comes from. In 1940, his father, George, died.
Yeah, losing a parent is always tough, but for Ed, it meant he was completely under his mother's control. No buffer. Their relationship was already unhealthy, and this just made it worse.
And then 4 years later, Ed's brother, Henry, dies in a fire. Officially an accident, but there are always those rumors that Ed might have been involved.
That fire is a real mystery. We may never know the truth about Henry's death, but what is clear is that Henry was a potential source of support for Ed, someone who might have challenged Augusta. His death left Ed even more isolated and vulnerable.
Makes you wonder what Henry saw or knew, and if speaking up cost him his life. But the real turning point, the moment everything changed, was 1945, when Augusta died.
It's like the anchor that kept Ed tethered to reality was gone. He was completely alone, and his grief, well, it went in a very dark direction. He sealed off most of the house, kept his mother's room exactly as it was, like a shrine.
Yeah, that's a little creepy. Shows you how attached he was to her, even after she was gone.
It definitely suggests he was really dependent on her, even in death. It's a sign that he couldn't cope with loss in a healthy way. And it set the stage for him to get sucked into this world of, well, macabre fascinations.
And this is where things get really dark. Ed starts withdrawing from society, becomes obsessed with anatomy, reads about Nazi atrocities and the occult.
His interest in those topics is pretty telling, I think. The Nazis, with their cruelty and dehumanization, it might have reflected Ed's own struggles with empathy, and his detachment from humanity. The occult, with its focus on death and the afterlife, well, that could have given him a framework for his developing psychosis. Remember, he's already isolated, dealing with this huge loss. These morbid interests, along with his fragile mental state and lack of social interaction, allowed his warped view of reality to solidify without any kind of challenge.
Sounds like a perfect storm brewing in his mind.
And all of this is happening in total isolation, which means these thoughts and fantasies just grow and fester. This is where you see how dangerous isolation and lack of connection can be. With no outside input, Ed was free to create his own world, a world that was increasingly detached from reality. It's chilling to think about, what was going on in Ed Gein's mind during this time, isolated, alone with these dark impulses. And it wasn't long before those impulses turned into actions. Between 1947 and 1952, Ed started sneaking out at night.
Not to the local bar.
No, not exactly. He was going to graveyards.
And not just to, pay respects. Right, he is digging up graves, we know that. But it's his choice of victims that's really disturbing. He targeted the graves of recently deceased middle-aged women. Why those women?
Yeah, that's a big clue. Those women, they all look like his mother, Augusta. So it wasn't just a random fascination with death, It was about trying to recapture something he'd lost. This twisted way to stay connected to his mother.
Okay, so we've got grave rubbing, stealing bodies. This is already way beyond disturbing. But then it gets worse, right? He wasn't content with just keeping these bodies. He started to make things. And that's where the story gets truly horrifying. What exactly was he making? And what did these macabre creations tell us about his mental state?
I mean, try to imagine walking into Ed Gein's farmhouse and seeing what those investigators saw. Lampshades made of human skin, belts made from nipples, masks carefully crafted from the faces of corpses. It's hard to even comprehend.
It's like something out of a nightmare.
And it was horrifying, yes. But for Ed, these were just random acts. There's a twisted logic to it, his way of coping with his loss and desires.
So was he trying to recleanse his mother with these things he was making? Or was it something else, something deeper he couldn't control?
That's the question, isn't it? Probably a mix of things. He had to factor in his attachment to his mother, the trauma of her death, the isolation, his distorted view of reality. It's possible on some level he was trying to recreate her to keep her close to him. But then there's also the necrophilia to consider.
Right, that sexual attraction to corpses.
Exactly. It's a complex and disturbing condition. And it definitely played a part in his behavior.
It seems like there's an element of control there too, right? Like by taking these bodies and transforming them, he was exerting a sense of power over them, a power he maybe didn't have in his own life.
Absolutely. This wasn't just about grief or morbid curiosity. It was about dominance, possession. These women, who reminded him of his mother, were now his to control, to do whatever he wanted with.
It's a terrifying example of how isolation, mental illness, and these unchecked urges can create something truly monstrous. But his crimes didn't stop with grave robbing and, crafting with human remains. In 1957, a woman named Bernice Worden, she owned a hardware store in town, disappeared. And that's when Ed Gein's reign of terror was finally exposed. This wasn't about the dead anymore. This was about taking a life.
Yeah, Bernice Worden's disappearance was a turning point. She was well-liked, respected. Her vanishing scared everyone. And Ed, well, he was kind of an oddball. He was the last one to see her. So the police went to his farmhouse, and man, they had no idea what they were walking into.
I mean, they find Bernice Worden's body in his shed. But that's just the beginning. What did they find inside that house?
It was a night there. Skulls turned into bowls, chairs upholstered in human skin. That belt made of nipples, it must have been. Just horrifying for those investigators. A house of horrors.
And those masks, those faces of corpses just turned into masks, like something straight out of a movie.
We can't forget, though, those masks. Those were real people. Lives stolen and desecrated.
So what happened after they made this horrifying discovery? What did Ed Gein do?
He confessed, admitted to killing Bernice Worden and another woman, Mary Hogan, who disappeared a few years before. What's really strange is his confessions were just so matter-of-fact, no remorse, no emotion, like he didn't even understand what he'd done.
Like it didn't even faze him. Which brings us to his mental state, right? Schizophrenia, a serious mental illness that can distort reality. Was he considered legally insane? Did he even go to trial?
His mental state was a huge part of the case. They found him incompetent to stand trial at first and sent him to a mental institution. And that decision, well, it caused a lot of debate about how the legal system deals with people who have serious mental illness and commit crimes. It was a landmark case. It made everyone think about how to balance justice with compassion.
It's something we still struggle with today, right?
Yeah.
Where's the line between responsibility and mental illness?
Tough question. And Ed Gein's case forced us to face it. to consider what it means when someone's perception of reality is so distorted.
So he spends years in this institution. Did he get better? Did he ever express any remorse for what he did?
Well, according to reports, he was a pretty model patient, did crafts, read books, but there's nothing to suggest that he ever truly understood what he did or that he felt any real remorse.
That's almost more disturbing, isn't it, to think that he could just seem normal, like the darkness was still there, just under the surface.
Ed Gein's case reminds us that mental illness is complex. It doesn't always look the way we think it should. And it's tempting to just label him as evil, but his story shows how powerful mental illness can be, how fragile the human mind really is.
After more than a decade in the institution, Gein was eventually deemed competent to stand trial. What happened then?
In 1968, they put him on trial for Bernice Worden's murder. They found him guilty, but because of his insanity plea, he was sent back to the institution instead of prison. And that, of course, caused more controversy. People were outraged that he wouldn't serve time.
Brought up all those questions again. What's justice? What's insanity? How do we understand mental illness?
It wasn't just about Ed Gein anymore. His case became this symbol. It sparked a conversation about how we, as a society, deal with mental illness, especially when it's connected to crime.
And even after he died, he still had this hold on us. Ed Gein died in 1984, but he's more than just a true crime story now. He's this cultural phenomenon. Why do you think his case, with all its gruesome details, still fascinates people?
I think there's this morbid curiosity, right? We want to understand what makes people like him tick. How can someone do such horrible things? But there's also fear. The idea that anyone, even someone who seems normal, could be capable of this kind of evil.
And his influence on movies, on popular culture, it's huge. Psycho with Norman Bates, I mean, come on, that's Ed Gein.
Right. The isolated location, the unhealthy relationship with his mother, the creation of this alternate personality. It's like Ed Gein's case provided a way to explore the dark side of human nature, the possibility that anyone could be capable of these things.
And it wasn't just Psycho, right? Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs. Those movies, they're drawing on the real-life horror of Ed Gein.
He became this archetype, I guess, this symbol of our anxieties about violence and madness. And the fact that these characters were still so popular, so disturbing, shows how powerful his story is and how it makes us question what it means to be human. But beyond all that, Ed Gein's case also had a big impact on the field of criminal psychology.
Yeah, it must have been a real puzzle for them. Schizophrenia, necrophilia, obsessive-compulsive tendencies. It's a unique and disturbing combination.
It was like a glimpse into the darkest parts of the human mind. His case changed the way we think about what motivates criminals. It shows how mental illness, childhood trauma, and social factors can all work together to shape a person's behavior.
It reminds us that even the most monstrous acts can have complicated roots. And we need to understand those roots if we want to prevent things like this from happening again.
Right. It's not about making excuses for Ed Gein. It's about using his case to learn more about mental illness, social isolation, and to promote compassion and understanding. It's about seeing the warning signs, stepping in early, and supporting those who need help.
We've covered a lot, from Gein's tough childhood to his crimes and his legacy, but we're not done yet. There's one more chapter to this story, his death and burial.
And it's a fitting ending. It raises some questions about how we deal with death and the macabre.
It's kind of strange, A man who spent so much of his life digging up graves, disturbing the dead, couldn't even find peace in his own. Where was Ed Gein buried?
Plainfield Cemetery, right next to his family. You'd think that would be the end of it, right?
Yeah.
But even in death, Ed Gein couldn't escape what he did. His grave became this weird tourist attraction.
People are actually going to see it.
Yeah, out of curiosity, morbid curiosity. And the headstone was always getting vandalized, people chipping away at it, trying to, erase his name. Like they wanted to deny him even a proper grave.
But that just makes it more, infamous.
Exactly. It just draws more attention. And then, get this, in 2000, someone stole the entire headstone.
Seriously?
Stole it. It was recovered eventually, but, come on. It shows you the power Ed Gein still has over people, this fascination.
We talked about his impact on movies, popular culture, but it's deeper than that. He's this boogeyman, this cautionary tale that we can't shake. Why do you think that is? Why are people still so fixated on him, even now?
I think it's because we have this complicated relationship with evil, right? We're repulsed by it, but we're also drawn to it. We want to understand how someone like Ed Gein could exist. But it also scares us. It reminds us that anyone is capable of darkness, that the line between normal and, depraved can be really thin.
So what happened to the headstone? Is it back on his grave?
Nope, they keep it in storage now, safe from vandals and souvenir hunters. His grave is just unmarked, a patch of ground.
That's pretty ironic, isn't it? The guy who craved attention, who made those horrifying displays, ends up anonymous, forgotten.
It is kind of ironic, but it also reminds us that the real horror of Ed Gein's story isn't the shock value. It's the violation of human dignity, the pain he caused, the trauma that doesn't go away.
Right, the human cost. It's easy to get lost in the psychology, the cultural impact, but we can't forget about the victims.
Exactly. Their families.
Yeah.
The scars that Ed Gein left behind.
Well, we've taken a pretty deep dive here into the life and crimes of Ed Gein, the man who became a symbol of our darkest fears, from his troubled childhood to his descent into madness and all those shocking discoveries. But as we wrap up, I want to hear from you, the listener. What part of Ed Gein's story stayed with you? What questions does it raise for you? About human nature, about evil, about why we're so fascinated by the macabre? Keep thinking about these things because sometimes facing the darkness can help us understand ourselves and the world a little better.